Thank you. I'll just put those on full slideshow. Yeah, so thanks, Kate, for the introduction, and I hope everybody can hear me well this morning. This project, as Kate has said, is under the UK Climate Resilience Programme. It's been conducted myself with Dr. Christina Dembski, who's a lecturer in the School of Psychology, and Katrin Stengers, who isn't with us today, and also Abigail Seabrook and Dr. Adam Corner of Climate Outreach, who are our outreach partners on the project. It has run from February 2019 through to October 2020, as you've been told, is part of the UKRI initiative in the first phase. I'd like to first thank the Stakeholder Advisory Board, who had a very, very constructive engagement with a range of stakeholders, both in helping us to design the survey and to interpret some of the results. And I won't read those all out, but it's been extremely useful to have that input at an early and towards the middle of the project. So why are we here, and why is this project here? And I suppose most people on the webinar today will know about the UK climate change risk assessment process. There's a new one being prepared. There's one every 5 years as part of the Climate Change Act. So 2021 has the next one in. And associated with that, a number of adaptation programme strategies, both from DEFRA for the UK, England primarily, and then Scotland and Wales, the devolved and the devolved administrations respond to that.
Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your slides. Can you check that your slide sharing is working, please?
Ah, I'm sorry. I will start again. Apologise for this. Is that better?
That's coming now. Yeah, we can see that.
I'm sorry, that's me jumping again. Okay, well, so you've seen the title, so we don't want to repeat that, and the people involved. And thank you very much. I will leave that one on for a second, for the advisory board, who've given us great support during the project, and the climate change risk assessment with the various adaptation plans. Now, we've known for a number of years, actually, that the issue of dangerous climate change was not just a science question. It involves perceptions, understandings, values and judgments, but also that having done a risk assessment for climate change, there is a question of communicating, and all best practice in risk communication says you need to know the frame of reference of the stakeholder or the intended participant of any communication in order to design messages in an appropriate way. We'll see a good example of that around heat risk, actually, as we go along. So really this project jumps off that observation that in order to help really the climate change risk assessment process, as well as other stakeholders who are involved in climate risk communication for adaptation, this is basic intelligence and data to help you think through how the public views this issue. So we had a number of objectives for the project, some slightly more academic than others, but the one I'm really talking about today is the top one, public perceptions of climate impacts, risks and resilience. It's important to bear in mind that at the time of the conducting in the field work and the survey work, a number of things had been going on over a number of years, but also within the year previously. We'd seen extreme weather events around the globe, some of which have been part attributed by scientists to climate change effects, or certainly discussed as the new normal for the future. The political scene was absolutely dominated by Brexit at that point in time. That's worth bearing in mind when we see the first set of data, actually, and the 2019 election. So that was all going up. We can all remember that as a rather stressful time, I think. But also, we'd had about a year in the UK and worldwide of the climate change protests by Extinction Rebellion and other groups. So very, very high media coverage of climate change alongside some of those, the political situation around Brexit at the time. The methodology was an online survey. We used Qualtrics. It was a nationally represented quota sample of 1,401 responses. And this is the key point, which we'll come back to right at the end. The data was collected between 14th and 22nd of October 2019. So you have to take yourself back to that socio-political context, I think, to fully put the data in its appropriate position. Things have slightly changed now. Again, I'll come back to that right at the end of the talk. There are two reports, they're both on, actually they're on Climate Outreach and Cardiff University websites, but you can find them in fact on the UK Climate Resilience website. And if you look for our project page, RESiL-RISK, you'll find the links there. And they're fairly comprehensive. The first one, the top line findings on the left-hand side, and basically what I'll be talking about today. And then the Climate Outreach have produced a briefing for UK communicators, which sort of summarises some of the policy lessons from this piece of research. Also, during the talk, I'll be talking about two previous comparable surveys. First, what we call EPCC, European Perception of Climate Change, which we ran in Cardiff University in our research group, along with colleagues from 3 other European countries, very large piece of work in 2016, which focused more on mitigation than adaptation, that would be fair to say, and climate change beliefs. And then the PREPARE project, which was a major piece of work conducted in 2013 by Ricardo and Ipsos and Leeds University. And that was really the first and one of the only UK focus projects looking at climate adaptation beliefs. So the current study has been specifically designed to add items which exactly replicate some of the key items, both on PREPARE on EPCC, so that we can track beliefs over time. So what did we find? On perceptions of climate change, this is the most intriguing one in a way, and particularly if we put the 2016 results there on the right-hand side. We asked this as the first question on the survey: what will be the most important issue facing the UK in the next 20 years? Brexit also came out at 25%, given the context of what was going on. But surprisingly, climate change was just behind that. And that's even more surprising, given that when we asked the same question in 2016, only 2% of people mentioned spontaneously. People were free to say what they wanted of this question, that climate change was the most important issue. So clearly issue salience, as the political scientists call it, had gone up dramatically in that time period. And that was reinforced by loads of other measures on the survey. So for example, we asked about worry about climate change generically. You will see those who are very worried or extremely worried the percentage had doubled over that period, 2016 to 2019. We also asked a new question, because there's been a lot of discourse now about something called climate urgency. We must get on with doing stuff both on mitigation and adaptation as quickly as possible. And that hadn't really been asked in the past by anybody. So we've put it on the survey now. It will be asked in the future as a tracker item. And again, quite surprising that extremely high level of urgency or high level of urgency was endorsed by most of our participants. Climate change beliefs. This is interesting. We've done a lot of work in Cardiff on something called psychological distance of climate change. We've asked this since actually 2010. These are all samples of 1,000. And if you look at the top blue line, that is people who say we are already feeling the effects of climate change. And that has gone up steadily and markedly over that 10-year or 9-year period, from 41 to 64%. We conclude from that people feel, temporarily at least, that climate change is much more salient. It's happening now, it's closer to us. However, when you asked about geographical and social salience, the people who think climate change is extremely serious, for your family, UK, people in developing countries, people still think that the impacts are going to be happening elsewhere and to other people, not to me personally. So there's still some work to be done about making climate change personal to people and personal to their local situation and families. Psychological drivers, we asked in 2016 a number of emotion questions, because we know they are related sometimes to intention to take particular behaviours or to support action, and things like guilt, fear and outrage had increased markedly. probably not surprising given the various media coverage that had occurred over the previous year. Risk perception on climate change impacts. We asked another open-ended question: what are the most important effects for the UK in the dark blue and your community in the light blue? And you'll see whether we're wetter storms, rain, floods, hotter, warm, dry heat waves, and different, unpredictable. And then don't know or little or no effect. And you'll see probably there's more uncertainty about the effect on local communities, particularly in relation to heat or unpredictable weather, than there is in relation to the UK as a whole. So again, one of the messages there is to try and bring some of the impacts home locally to people in relation to that. How serious a problem? Various issues. Flooding was always a serious problem, as people saw from the PAIR data, but this is the big change, which will come back to time and time again in the survey. On a whole range of measures, we saw heat, which had a very low salience, but is a very, very serious risk, as judged by the previous climate change risk assessments, has become much more salient to people in the public mental model of climate change. And you'll see also hot summers went from 18 to 63%. So all of these, most other than flooding, have increased a little bit, but heat in particular has increased greatly. And of course, we found self-reported heat impacts, experience of heat impacts. We see here discomfort, health affected, or disruption to travel has pretty well doubled on all the measures since the 2013 Prepare project asked those questions. So people are reporting more personal experience. It's not the whole story, because clearly some of the extreme weather events around heat we've seen will have impacted people's beliefs about heat. We asked concern about specific impacts, and again, these have increased sort of across the board. I think that would be fair to say, on a range of very specific impacts in comparison to 2013 PAIR report. And you'll see again, the big change is really on heat disruption, cities and towns becoming unbearably hot due to heat waves. We interpret this as a communication opportunity, I think, whereas it would have been quite hard to talk about heat and climate change in the UK 7 or 8 years ago. 6 or 7 years ago, now that is no longer the case. I think there's a message there that people are likely to accept around heat, and that's very important, I think, from a stakeholder perspective. Link between attribution. There's been a lot of discussion in the media about the attribution between certain events over the last few years and climate change. Obviously, we know climate attribution is not a straightforward thing from a science perspective, but people are, and we've had other evidence on other surveys, beginning to link a number of events, both in the UK and around the world, to climate change. And you'll see there, very few people actually did not play a role in causing this event think that that's the case in relation to a number of these weather events that have occurred. So again, there's a communication opportunity there to reinforce those beliefs around appropriate attribution studies, I should say. You need both to be done. We asked about priorities for climate adaptation. We asked a number of questions about this, and I won't show them all, but I'll show the ideal level of protection per social goods service. So we gave people a number of things that would need protecting under climate change. And really the sum of the story there is people do want things to be protected, which is a very encouraging result. But at the top, you tended to get things in relation to people, health and well-being. So you can see there the top 3 with very high endorsement. High protection, extremely high protection are the 2 lightest purple bars there on the graph on the right-hand side. On the left, the most endorsed is protection of the most vulnerable people, and then ensuring social services. You can interpret those as kind of just transition equity measures as well, I think, underlying that we don't want vulnerable people to suffer from climate change. And then the generic health and well-being of all UK citizens. We did a prioritisation task. We asked people to allocate tokens representing resources that the UK government might spend on adaptation to climate change. And when we did that, actually, very similar rank ordering, you'll see the health and well-being of all UK citizens came up as top. I don't think it means other things are unimportant to people, but it's clear that health is a very important issue in relation to adaptation over time. So the next one down, obviously, the fourth one is food supplies, which are very important. And then towards the bottom, actually, were economic impacts and some infrastructure impacts in particular. Others were in the middle of the list. Support for climate action and policy. This is very important as well. And we've asked a whole range of questions about this on the survey. In terms of adaptation policies, well, broadly, there's not much differentiation. People do support or strongly support the sorts of things one might need to be doing in the UK to adapt to climate change. I think the one that was the least supported in this whole list of questions we asked was assisting communities at risk of flooding to move elsewhere. But even there, very, very few people tended to or strongly opposed that measure. So that's good for adaptation. Climate adaptation has been seen almost as the Cinderella of climate change discourse and policy over many, many years. And this gives clear evidence that people want a focus on adaptation and the resources to be spent in protecting parts of the UK's infrastructure and people. Yeah, sorry, so that's the tend to or strongly. Here, let me get this one right, sorry. We also asked about mitigation policies. We've asked about this on a number of surveys in the past, and this is not a surprising result, but again, certain things are very, very heavily supported, like renewable energy. People really like wind and solar power. Other things a little less so. But as soon as you start asking about how we might pay for that, or taxes, or increasing prices in order to reduce consumption, then you get less endorsement. So those are a much more controversial set of measures. I think that would be fair to say. So paying for mitigation is a more tricky issue in terms of people's endorsement for that type of measure. We asked also in relation to the policy landscape about a number of things. We asked about climate emergencies, so very strong support for a national declaration of climate emergency. In terms of the protests, there was less so, and I suppose that was in the middle or towards the end of a lot of disruption that had been that had occurred across the UK, some of it with very high media profile. So not everybody was supportive of the international protests to raise climate change awareness. But equally, I think if you were Ipsos, somebody from Ipsos Mori, you would say, well, there is actually a net support, quite a reasonable net support to that. So it's not that the protests are unsupported by the general UK population. Perceptions of actors and their motivations, I think this is the last key set of issues that we asked about. And as I say, I would urge people to go and have a look at the report and download the report. It's a very detailed set of findings. We've got a number of items that I'm not showing today that are on there. This is interesting. So we asked about responsibility for reducing emissions, responsibility for preparing for impacts. And it's often the case that questions ask about responsibility for mitigation, but less so for adaptation. And it's clear that the UK government, or government in general, let's put it that way, stands in for large actors who are able to affect change, are seen as having a higher responsibility for adaptation than for reducing emissions. And you might ask why that is, but of course, again, if you ask who should be responsible for reducing emissions in an open-ended question, you often get all of us. So people understand that they have a role to play alongside larger actors, whereas with adaptation, excuse me, really some of the interventions are at a very large scale. So they're the sorts of things like flood defences that only governments or local authorities or large actors can actually put into place. This is a regular question, trust and distrust. We always ask this about science questions from GM through to nuclear power, etc. And who do you trust as a source of information? This is not surprising at all. Scientists tend still to be supported or to have the trust of public groups in relation to science questions. So it seems like the public are not fed up with experts, unlike some politicians in the past. The Committee on Climate Change, although we didn't define who they were, again, had support from a large number of our respondents. UK government, by contrast, and that's not surprising at all, had relatively low trust to give people information about climate change, which is something probably government needs to work on as a whole. So key findings, and then I'll wrap up without really going through these in great detail. Perceptions of climate change. This really interesting result. It was the second most mentioned top issue facing the UK, and that issue salience is often seen by political scientists as a very, very important indicator of subsequent action, high level some worrying, urgency and concern associated with that. On underlying beliefs, people think the impacts are happening now, but they probably feel less personally at risk. So there's a question there about how that can be made more salient to people, and certainly a lot more anger, guilt and outrage associated with climate change. On perception and protection, obviously flooding remains the top risk. It always has been in the UK because of many of the things that continue to happen. If we think about the floods that happened back in February of this year. Perceptions of climate, other perceptions of climate change, especially heat, have increased. So there's this simultaneous increase of heat-related experiences is a communication opportunity, I think, around climate adaptation, and a very important one as well. And this is interesting as well. Climate action, majority support for adaptation policies and many of the mitigation policies, which is again is very important from a climate change risk assessment perspective, and in relation to the climate adaptation plans. And then act as a motivation. I've just gone through that, so I won't repeat that. I wanted to just say briefly the second document that was produced from this research, which is really a reflection on the findings in relation to climate change risk communication and UK communicators, was produced by Climate Outreach and was launched in March in parallel with the top line findings report that I've talked about. And they come to 7 conclusions, which sort of reiterate some of what I've been saying. But we have some very important starting points for public engagement. That's their first point, that climate change concern is at an all-time high, and adaptation policies are supported and across the political spectrum as well. I think the data showed that. Secondly, impacts are increasingly salient, and this surging concern around extreme heat. And that opens up a new front, I think, for public engagement around not just flooding effects in the UK, it's other issues that are now getting into that mental model. Climate change is getting closer to home, but as I've already indicated, maybe there's more to be done to actually relate that to people's local contexts and how it affects them and potentially affects them and their families going forward in their local place. Framing messages. The point about mitigation and adaptation, again, sometimes there's been an argument you shouldn't talk about adaptation because it then might generate a moral hazard for not focusing on mitigation, which clearly is the most important cause of climate change. But I think they're two parts of the same coin, so we shouldn't feel afraid. They reinforce each other, and all of our data would suggest that. Health, risks, well-being and adaptation, that's very important. We've seen that. That's what people want to prioritise initially, or that's the top priority. But of course, don't assume much existing knowledge when actually communicating around that question. We've also touched upon in the survey, although they didn't ask directly, this idea of just transition. And I think what comes out, I think, reading into the data, is that just transition applies to adaptation as well as mitigation, and that will be very important. And it seems that, you know, there seems to be a move from concern to more commitment around climate change. I think that would be fair to say. So that again could be a platform for deepening public engagement on the issue. Okay. Now, and I will finish, it's 1/2 now, so I've just got a couple more slides, and you can read that and see that. Because of these findings, we were all geared up to have a good conversation with with the Climate Change Committee and others, DEFRA, who are working on the climate change risk assessment, the new one, to think through what some of the communication challenges would be. But we, of course, in April, we sat down and realised that maybe all the findings would be invalidating because of the new normal. There's a psychological theory, we only have a finite pool of worry. and therefore when something really big and new comes into our life space, then everything else is forced out. So has the coronavirus pandemic forced out some of the concerns about climate change that were there last October? So in order to actually, I think, have a robust conversation now with those of you in the stakeholder community over the next year or so, we really need to check how solid these findings were in relation to the concerns about and whether they would get into competition with the pandemic concerns, which are obviously extremely salient to people currently. So what we've done, very simple, is just to repeat some of the core survey items. We've added a few green recovery items. This went online eventually in August with a sample of, so it's very, very recent, which is why I can't actually show you any of the findings. I think we only saw them on Monday, saw the data set on Monday, with a comparable sample. So we will be able to look at any potential change from October. Watch this space. What I would say, I think we have had a look, and through some of the core psychological distance, etc. concern measures, we don't think there are huge changes, and that's interesting, I think, from our perspective. We're not sure about the open-ended items because they need much more complicated quantitative coding. So I think we will get back to people to report on that at a slightly later stage. So this was an entirely unanticipated extra piece of fieldwork that the Climate Resilience Programme have got from the project, actually at no extra cost, I should say, so we've done it within the existing budget. So I'm sure Sarat and the others are very happy about that. And that's my contact details. Do go to the Climate Resilience webpage to get both of the reports, and then I'm very, very happy to take questions as we go along. And I will try to unshare my screen.